53 BC. The Parthian Desert. 10,000 Roman soldiers vanish into the sand. Not defeated. Not captured. Vanished. The greatest military machine in the ancient world sends an entire legion into the east. 6,000 men, full battle formation, the pride of Rome. They march into battle against the Parthian Empire. They lose. But here's the mystery, only half the bodies are ever found. 4,000 Romans are listed as killed in battle. 2,000 are confirmed captured. But the remaining 4,000, they simply disappear from history. No graves. No records. No trace. For 2,000 years, historians have asked the same question: what happened to the lost legion of Rome? Some say they were sold into slavery and died in obscurity. Others claim they escaped east, so far east that Rome never found them. And then, in 1940s China, a discovery was made that changed everything. A remote village where the inhabitants have Roman features, green eyes, aquiline noses, light brown hair. Where children practice formations that look exactly like Roman military drills. Where DNA testing reveals European ancestry that shouldn't exist. Could the lost legion have survived? Could Roman soldiers have walked across the entire ancient world and built a new life 5,000 miles from home? This is the story of Rome's greatest mystery, and the evidence is more shocking than anyone imagined. To understand how a Roman legion could vanish, we need to understand the battle that destroyed them. May, 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, leads 7 legions, 42,000 men, into Parthian territory. Crassus is part of the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Caesar has conquered Gaul. Pompey has conquered the East. Crassus needs military glory to match them. So he launches an invasion of Parthia, modern-day Iran and Iraq, without Senate approval, without just cause. It's a vanity campaign. And it will become Rome's worst military disaster in a century. The Parthians meet him at Carrhae, near the modern Syrian-Turkish border. The Roman force is massive, heavy infantry, cavalry, supply trains. The Parthians field only 10,000 men. Crassus is confident. He shouldn't be. The Parthian commander, Sharina, has revolutionized warfare. His army is composed almost entirely of horse archers, mobile, fast, deadly. They use composite bows that can pierce Roman armor at 200 yards. And they employ a tactic the Romans have never encountered, the Parthian shot. They ride toward the Romans, unleash volleys of arrows, then wheel their horses and fire backwards while retreating, shooting while riding at full gallop in the opposite direction. The Romans form their traditional defensive square, shields locked, waiting for the Parthian charge. But the charge never comes. The Parthians just circle, shooting, retreating, shooting again. Hour after hour. The Romans can't advance. If they break formation, they'll be slaughtered. They can't retreat. They're surrounded. They can only stand there and die slowly. The Battle of Carrhae lasts one day. By sunset, 20,000 Romans are dead. Crassus's son, Publius, leads a cavalry charge to break the encirclement. He and his entire unit, 1,000 men, are annihilated. The Parthians mount Publius's head on a spear and parade it in front of the Roman lines. Crassus, watching his son's head being mocked by the enemy, suffers a complete psychological collapse. His officers beg him to retreat. He can barely speak. Finally, under cover of darkness, the Romans attempt to escape. But they're disorganized, panicked, broken. Thousands are cut down during the retreat. Crassus himself is captured during a fake negotiation and executed. According to legend, the Parthians poured molten gold down his throat, a symbolic death for the richest man in Rome, killed by his own greed. By the time the survivors stagger back to Roman Syria, the count is devastating: 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured, 12,000 escaped. But the numbers don't add up. 7 legions equal 42,000 men. The casualties only account for 40,000. What happened to the other 2,000? Roman records mention them only once. They're listed as missing in action. And then there's a second mystery. Of the 10,000 captured Romans, about half, roughly 4,000 to 5,000, are sent to the eastern frontier of the Parthian Empire as prisoner soldiers, forced to defend Parthia's border against nomadic tribes. They're sent to Margiana, modern-day Turkmenistan, the edge of the known world. And then they too vanish from history. No records of their release. No mention of their deaths. They simply disappear into the east. For 400 years, no one mentions them. Roman historians record the disaster at Carrhae in detail: Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Livy all describe the battle. But the captured legionaries are forgotten. The Roman Senate is too embarrassed by the defeat to investigate further. The survivors who return to Rome never speak of those left behind. It's as if those thousands of men simply ceased to exist. But in 20 BC, something strange happens. A Roman diplomat named Gaius Julius Caesar, not the famous Julius Caesar, but a distant relative, travels to Parthia to negotiate the return of legionary standards captured at Carrhae. The Parthians agree and return the eagles, the sacred military standards that symbolize Roman honor. It's a huge diplomatic victory. But the diplomat notices something odd. He writes in his report that he encountered men in Parthian service who appeared to be of Roman origin but spoke a corrupted Latin mixed with Eastern tongues. He doesn't elaborate. The report is filed and forgotten. Then, in the 1st century AD, a Chinese historian named Ban Jiyu writes the Book of Han, chronicling the Han Dynasty. In it, he describes a battle in 36 BC between Chinese forces and a nomadic tribe near the Talas River, in modern-day Kazakhstan. The nomads, he writes, were defending a city called Jiji. And here's where it gets strange. Ban Jiyu describes the defenders using a fish-scale formation, soldiers arranged in overlapping rows, shields locked together. This is a perfect description of the Roman testudo formation. But there were no Romans in Central Asia in 36 BC. Or were there? The Chinese account is specific. After defeating the nomads at Jiji, the Han army captured about 1,000 prisoners who fought in the Western manner. These prisoners were described as tall, with high noses, deep-set eyes, and hair in unusual colors, features that didn't match any known Central Asian people. The Chinese, not knowing what to do with them, resettled them in a remote frontier town. They called the town Liqian, the ancient Chinese name for Rome. The town still exists. Today it's called Zhalaishai, or Liqian village, in Gansu province, China. And the people who live there look different from other Chinese populations. Many have green or blue eyes. Some have light brown or reddish hair. Facial features include prominent noses and deeper eye sockets than typical Han Chinese features. In 1940, a Chinese professor named Homer Dubs proposed a controversial theory. The soldiers who defended Jiji using Roman tactics were the remnants of Crassus's lost legion. Dubs argued that the captured Romans, forced to serve on the Parthian frontier, eventually encountered nomadic raiders. During a raid around 50 BC, the Romans either escaped or were captured again and pressed into service by the nomads. For the next 15 years, they served as mercenaries, gradually moving east along the Silk Road. By 36 BC, they traveled 5,000 miles from Carrhae to Central Asia. They ended up defending a nomadic chieftain against the Chinese. After their defeat, the Chinese resettled them in Liqian. And there, isolated for 2,000 years, they survived. Their descendants are still there. Is this possible? Or is it a romantic fantasy? Let's examine the evidence. First, the Chinese military records. Ban Gu's description of the fish-scale formation is too specific to be coincidence. The testudo was uniquely Roman. No other military force in the ancient world used this exact defensive formation. Second, the genetic evidence. In 2005, DNA testing was conducted on residents of Liqian village. The results showed that roughly 56% of the population carries genetic markers common in Europe and the Mediterranean but rare in East Asia. Specifically, haplogroup R1a, which is associated with European populations. This European DNA didn't arrive during the colonial period. It's ancient, integrated into the population for millennia. Third, physical features. Anthropological studies show that Liqian residents have statistically higher rates of green-blue eyes, light hair, and facial structures more common in Mediterranean populations than in East Asian populations. Fourth, cultural practices. Until recently, Liqian villagers practiced combat drills that resembled Roman formations. They raised cattle using techniques more common in Mediterranean agriculture than Chinese farming. They built homes with courtyards and archways similar to Roman architecture. But here's where the evidence gets complicated. Other geneticists argue that the European DNA could have come from Indo-European migrations thousands of years before Rome even existed. The Tocharians, an Indo-European people, lived in western China from 2000 BC. Their DNA would look similar to European markers. The physical features could be explained by these ancient migrations, not by Roman soldiers arriving in 36 BC. Most mainstream historians are deeply skeptical of the Roman legion theory. Their arguments are compelling. First, the numbers don't work. If 4,000 to 5,000 Romans were captured at Carrhae and sent to Margiana, and if a portion escaped or were captured by nomads, the maximum number who could have reached Jiji is perhaps 1,000 to 1,500. The Chinese captured 1,000 prisoners total at Jiji, but not all of them were described as looking Western. Maybe 100 to 300 were actually European in appearance. That's a tiny founder population. Can 100 to 300 people leave a genetic legacy that affects 56% of a modern village? Geneticists say it's unlikely without extreme isolation and inbreeding. Second, the timeline is tight. Carrhae happens in 53 BC. Jiji happens in 36 BC. That's 17 years to travel 5,000 miles across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories. It's possible, but it would require the Romans to move almost constantly, averaging 300 miles per year. Third, there's no direct archaeological evidence. No Roman weapons have been found in Liqian. No armor. No inscriptions in Latin. No Roman coins. Everything is circumstantial: genetic data, physical appearance, second-hand historical accounts. Fourth, the Chinese account never explicitly says the defenders were Roman. It says they fought in a Western manner and looked Western. But Western to the Han Chinese could mean anything from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. The Seleucids, the Bactrians, the Scythians, all had Western features and military traditions that might resemble Roman tactics. If the Roman legion theory is questionable, what are the alternatives? Theory 1. The European DNA in Liqian comes from the Tocharians. The Tocharians were an Indo-European people who lived in the Tarim Basin from roughly 2000 BC to 800 AD. They had red and blonde hair, blue and green eyes, and spoke Indo-European languages related to Celtic and Latin. Mummies discovered in Xinjiang province show Tocharian individuals with perfectly preserved European features. If Tocharians intermarried with Han Chinese populations, they could easily explain the genetic and physical evidence in Liqian. Theory 2. The defenders at Jiji were Greek mercenaries, not Romans. After Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek military culture spread across Central Asia. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom existed in the region from 250 BC to 125 BC. Greek soldiers used phalanx formations that could be confused with Roman testudo. If Greek mercenaries were serving nomadic tribes in 36 BC, the Chinese might have described them exactly as Ban Jiyu did. Theory 3. The entire connection is coincidental. The fish scale formation might have been independently developed. The European features might be normal genetic variation. The DNA markers might have multiple sources. Humans love patterns. We see connections where none exist. But here's the problem with all these alternative theories: none of them explain everything. The Tocharians don't explain the specific Roman military formation. The Greek mercenaries don't explain why the Chinese resettled them in a town called Rome. The coincidence theory requires too many coincidences. Which brings us back to the question: is it possible that Roman soldiers really did reach China? Let's trace the theoretical route. 53 BC, after Carrhae, 4,000 to 5,000 Romans are marched east to Margiana on the Parthian frontier. They're not imprisoned, they're used as garrison troops, defending against nomadic raids. For the next 10 to 15 years, they serve in this capacity, learning the region, adapting to local conditions. Some marry local women. Some rise in rank. Then, around 50 to 40 BC, a major nomadic invasion overwhelms the Parthian frontier. The garrison is defeated. Some Romans are killed. Others are captured by the nomads and impressed into service. This was common practice. Nomadic tribes valued trained soldiers and often absorbed defeated enemies into their armies. The Romans, now serving nomadic chieftains, begin moving east along trade routes. The Silk Road is just beginning to develop, but caravan routes exist. The Romans travel as guards, mercenaries, slaves, moving from oasis to oasis, surviving however they can. They pass through Bactria, through the Pamir Mountains, through the Tarim Basin. Each leg of the journey takes months or years. Some die from disease, exposure, combat. Others escape or are left behind. The group shrinks. By the time they reach the Talas River region in 36 BC, perhaps 300 to 500 remain. They're hired by a nomadic leader defending Jiji. They teach their employers Roman tactics. They fight one last battle against the Chinese. They lose. And then, finally, they stop running. The Chinese settle them in Liqian. After 17 years and 5,000 miles, the Lost Legion finds a home. In 2010, Chinese archaeologists began excavating sites around Liqian village, hoping to find definitive proof. They found ancient graves. They found pottery. They found tools and coins. But nothing definitively Roman. Then, in 2015, something remarkable happened. Researchers discovered ancient wooden slips, thin pieces of wood used for record-keeping in Han Dynasty China, that mentioned Liqian. One slip, dated to approximately 5 BC, describes Liqian as a settlement of foreigners from the western regions who serve as garrison troops. Another slip mentions soldiers skilled in the Western fighting method stationed there. This doesn't prove they were Roman, but it confirms that Liqian was settled by foreign soldiers from the West who had distinctive military training. And there's another clue buried in Chinese administrative records. The population of Liqian during the Han Dynasty is listed as approximately 1,500 people. That's exactly the right size for a settlement founded by a few hundred soldiers who then had families. The population remained stable for centuries, suggesting isolation, exactly what you'd expect for a remote frontier garrison. Modern Liqian has about 1,500 residents. The population hasn't changed in 2,000 years. But perhaps the strangest evidence comes from linguistics. In 2007, a linguist studying the Liqian dialect noticed something odd. The villagers use certain words that don't exist in standard Chinese but have cognates in Latin. The word for bread is similar to ponies. The word for wine resembles vinum. These could be coincidences. Or they could be fragments of a lost language, preserved for 2 millennia in an isolated village. So where's the definitive proof? Why hasn't someone found a Roman sword or a legionary helmet or an inscription saying Marcus was here? There are several possible explanations. First, metal was valuable. If the Romans had weapons or armor when they arrived, they would have used them until they broke, then melted them down for tools. After 2,000 years, nothing would remain. Second, the Chinese would have confiscated military equipment. Resettled foreigners wouldn't be allowed to keep weapons. Anything identifiably Roman would have been taken and either stored in imperial armories or melted down. Third, organic materials decay. Leather, wood, fabric, all the daily items that might prove Roman origin, decompose in decades, not centuries. What we'd need is something like a gravestone or a metal artifact buried in a dry, sealed tomb. And that's exactly what archaeologists are looking for. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar identified several large burial structures near Liqian that haven't been excavated. Chinese authorities are planning a full archaeological expedition, but progress is slow. These sites are protected heritage areas, and excavation requires extensive permits. But the potential is enormous. If those tombs contain European remains with Roman artifacts, it would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. If they don't, the mystery remains unsolved. Whether or not the Lost Legion reached China, their story tells us something profound about the ancient world. We imagine antiquity as isolated, Romans in Europe, Chinese in Asia, never the two meeting. But the reality was far more connected. The Silk Road facilitated not just trade but migration, warfare, cultural exchange. DNA evidence shows that by the time of the Roman Empire, genetic material was flowing between East and West constantly. European genes appear in Chinese populations. Asian genes appear in European populations. People moved. Ideas moved. Military tactics moved. The world was smaller than we think. And armies vanished all the time. Rome lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, 17,000 men slaughtered, and we know exactly where because archaeologists found the battlefield. But dozens of other legions simply disappear from records. They were disbanded, destroyed, or absorbed into other units. Their soldiers died, deserted, or retired in distant provinces. The difference with Crassus's legion is that we have a trail, faint, fragmented, but tantalizing. We have Chinese records that describe exactly what we'd expect to see if Roman soldiers had traveled east. We have genetic evidence that could support it. We have a village that preserves the memory. But we don't have certainty. And maybe that's fitting. The Romans were obsessed with documentation, with recording everything for posterity. But the Lost Legion, if it existed, would have been composed of forgotten men, prisoners, exiles, survivors who wanted to escape their past, not preserve it. Try to imagine it. You're a Roman soldier, 25 years old, marching into the Parthian desert under Crassus. You survive the slaughter at Carrhae. You're captured, shackled, marched east for months. You're sold to Parthian commanders and stationed on a frontier you can't even pronounce. You learn to speak a new language. You fight for an empire that isn't yours. Then you're captured again by nomads. You march further east, watching the landscape change from desert to mountains to steppes you never knew existed. You're thousands of miles from home. Everyone you knew is dead or lost. The Rome you remember is a memory, fading. You have two choices: die hoping to return, or live by adapting. You choose to live. You marry a local woman. You teach your children a few Latin words, a few stories about a city they'll never see. You teach them how to fight in formation, because it's the only thing you know how to teach. Generations pass. Your great-great-grandchildren speak Chinese. They look Chinese. But they have your eyes, your nose, your blood. And on certain nights, they practice formations they don't quite understand, because their grandfather said it was important. This is the story we want to believe. Not because it's proven, but because it reminds us that human beings are survivors. That even in the worst circumstances, defeat, capture, exile, people adapt, endure, create new lives. Today, you can visit Liqian village. You can walk the same streets where, perhaps, Roman soldiers once walked. You can meet the residents, see their faces, hear their stories. They know the legend. Some believe it. Some dismiss it. Some just shrug and say, "We are who we are." In the village square, there's a small monument, a Roman pillar erected in 2005 by Italian tourists who wanted to honor the possibility. It's kitsch, really. But it's also touching. Because regardless of DNA, regardless of proof, the story matters. It reminds us that borders are temporary. That empires rise and fall. That people survive. In 2020, advanced DNA sequencing was conducted on the oldest graves near Liqian. The results are still being analyzed. Perhaps we'll finally get our answer. Perhaps we'll find that the Lost Legion truly did reach China, the greatest journey in military history. Or perhaps we'll find that it's a beautiful coincidence, a myth we needed to believe. Either way, somewhere beneath the sand and stone of Central Asia, the truth is waiting. And until we find it, the Lost Legion remains what it's always been, Rome's greatest mystery. This was the Lost Legion of Rome.